Alapa friends, and welcome to this commemoration of the centenary of the Ascension of Abdu'l Bahá. We feel very blessed as a family to be able to prepare this presentation and to share it with you tonight. It's a very precious moment in history, and we're glad to be able to join you all together in commemorating this event. Tonight, we decided to share with you some of the stories of the friends who were present in the Holy Land at the time of the passing of Abdu'l Bahá. We know, in fact, there was only a handful of Western friends who were there. There were, of course, Persian believers, some who resided in the Holy Land and some who had come on pilgrimage. But of the Western friends, there were only 7 who were present at the time of his passing. They remained there after his passing and were present until the reading of his will and testament. And tonight we thought that we could perhaps share their memories with you as a way of getting a better understanding of this very precious moment. This is a picture of the 7 friends whom we're going to share with you their stories tonight. And this slide shows the portraits of these friends. From the left on the top to the right, we have Louise and John Bosch, Grace and Florian Krug, Curtis Kelsey, Saichiro Fujita, and Johanna Hauf. And these 7 friends are going to take us through our journey tonight with their stories. Our presentation is a little bit long, so we hope you'll be patient with us, but we hope you enjoy it. It will start out with stories about these believers, followed by some recollections about their memories of the passing of Abdu'l Bahá, and some stories about the funeral as well. The stories that we're going to share will take us up until about 1 o'clock in the morning. And at that time, we have also prepared a devotional program with some prayers and writings, and we ask you to join us in reading these prayers together. We'll call on you to do that as we get to the time. We hope that even though it's a slightly longer than usual program, because this is such an important occasion, we wanted to really mark this significant event, and we hope that these photographs and stories that we've prepared will give you a little glimpse into this unique and momentous period.
When we look back, it seems that Abdu'l Bahá chose those he wished to be there at the end of his earthly life. Some people had asked for permission to visit him, and he had gently said no. 2 of the very fortunate people whom Abdu'l Bahá allowed to come to the Holy Land were John and Louise Bosch. Both John and Louise were originally from Switzerland, though they in fact only met after immigrating separately to the United States. John moved to California and Louise to New York. John was trained as a winemaker, and in 1901 he moved to California, where he purchased 45 acres of land in a winery in a town called Geyserville. After becoming a Baha'i, he used the grapes growing on his land to produce only non-alcoholic grape juice. John and Louise later donated this property to the faith, and Geyserville became home to one of the first 3 Baha'i summer schools in North America. Here's a photo of a Baha'i feast held on John's 75th birthday at the property in Geyserville. Regular summer schools were held here for nearly 50 years from 1925 onwards. John became a Baha'i after encountering the faith at the age of 48. The story goes that while he was traveling by train in October 1903, he was sitting next to Mrs. Beckwith, one of the early Baha'is, and she was reading this book, The Life and Teachings of Abbas Effendi by Myron Phelps. He asked to look at it, read a few of the first pages, and felt strongly that he needed to read the whole book. Mrs. Beckwith told him, however, that if he wanted to do this, he would have to speak to Mrs. Helen Goodall, who lived in Oakland and was regarded as one of the mothers of the California Baha'i community. But Mrs. Beckwith warned John, saying that to hear of the faith is, quote, the greatest privilege, but that it would be followed by, quote, the greatest obligations. And if he was not ready to follow this, she told him it would be better for him not to know. Of course, John did want to know, and he went to meet Helen Goodall, and after coming to a number of meetings and corresponding with her, he wrote to Abdu'l Bahá confirming his faith. Here's a photograph of Helen Goodall outside her home in Oakland. You can see from the image on the left that she was named as one of the 19 disciples of Abdu'l Bahá. She had a very profound understanding of the faith and a deep love for Abdu'l Bahá. And in fact, she passed away less than 3 months after Abdu'l Bahá's passing. She herself said that she could not bear to live without the master. Her daughter, Ella Goodall Cooper, also served the faith devotedly for many years.
But now we return to the story of John and Louise. Louise Steffer was also born in Switzerland and immigrated to New York at the age of 19. She became a Baha'i in her 30s through meeting with some of the early Baha'is, including Fanny Montag, Sarah Farmer, and Lua Getzinger. She had the great privilege of going on pilgrimage in 1909, where she met Abdu'l Bahá. This pilgrimage was made together with these two wonderful souls, Mrs. Maples Maxwell and Mr. Sutherland Maxwell. She developed a deep friendship with May Maxwell, saying, "I was a young believer in New York and not yet understanding very well the message that I had received. In my love and friendship for May Maxwell, I found a complete transformation and a wholly new existence."
John and Louise got married in 1914 and received a tablet from Abdu'l Bahá blessing their union. They both had the opportunity of meeting Abdu'l Bahá when he visited the United States in 1912. In fact, the day after Abdu'l Bahá arrived in New York, John was so excited to see him that he rushed to the train station and jumped on the first overnight train across the country to see him. When he arrived in New York at 5 a.m., he went straight to the Hotel Ansonia and was ushered into the presence of Abdu'l Bahá. When they met, John said, "Abdu'l Bahá, I came 3,000 miles to see you." Abdu'l Bahá laughed heartily and said, "I came 8,000 miles to see you." John then expressed his concerns that he wasn't doing enough to serve the Baha'i faith. He told Abdu'l Bahá, "I am a foreigner, born in Switzerland, and have not the command of the English language. I would like to be a speaker. All I'm doing is to give away pamphlets and as many books as are printed." But Abdu'l Bahá told him, "You are doing well. You are doing better than talking. It is not always the elaborate talking, the movements of the lips that would accomplish results. It is the heart that is powerful. With you, it is not words. Your heart talks. With you, often silence talks and radiates. You are doing well. To live, to act is the true response." He then gave John the name of Nurani, which means illumined, enlightened, or radiant. On the same day, when Abdu'l Bahá was leaving the Hotel Ansonia by taxi, he put out his hand and pulled John into the taxi with him. After putting his arm around John's waist, he then placed his head on John's shoulder and fell asleep. The Baha'is had planned for Abdu'l Bahá to see all the sights of New York on the way to his next destination, but instead he slept the whole half hour on John's shoulder. As you will hear later on tonight, this was not the only occasion on which John had the great blessing of having Abdu'l Bahá rest on his shoulder, as he had the great privilege of being one of those who carried Abdu'l Bahá's coffin after his passing, resting it on the same shoulder.
From the accounts of the friends in the Holy Land, we can see that Abdu'l Bahá knew very well that he was nearing the end of his life. Many friends had asked permission to come on pilgrimage in the Holy Land, but he had declined their request. To John Bosch, however, he had written, "I am longing to see you," and when they had written to request permission, he responded in a cable, quote, "Bosch is permitted, Abbas." They arrived on 14th of November 1921, 2 weeks before Abdu'l Bahá's passing, and Louise Bosch wrote, quote, "One must know that to meet with that great one was a matter quite different from meeting anyone else, kings and princes included. It is almost impossible to describe just what one experienced in being with him. It is certain that the soul was stirred to its very depths. In his presence, the soul realized that it stood in the presence of its real master. His personality was a mirror of holiness and sanctity. As we stood in his holy presence, we felt aware of our unworthiness. We became conscious of our faults and shortcomings. We saw ourselves in our imperfections. We could only take refuge in the ocean of his understanding and in the sea of his love. Louise wrote an account of the passing of Abdu'l Bahá that we will share later with you tonight. But first, we should introduce some of the other Western friends who were in the Holy Land at that time.
Another who was permitted to come on pilgrimage was Johanna Hauff, a Baha'i from Stuttgart, Germany. This photograph is from 1952, showing the NSA of Germany and Austria, and shows Johanna in the front row, third from the left, wearing a black dress with her arms crossed in front of her. She in fact accompanied Louise and John Bosch in 1921, when they were traveling through Germany on their way to the Holy Land. Johanna was 19 years old when Abdu'l Bahá visited Stuttgart, Germany in 1913. There was already a small community of Baha'is in Stuttgart at the time, including Alma Knobloch, a German-American Baha'i who had pioneered in 1907 to Germany under the guidance of Abdu'l Bahá. Alma Knobloch helped to grow the Baha'i community by hosting Baha'i meetings almost every night of the week, by translating Baha'i writings in German, and arranging for Baha'i traveling teachers to visit Germany. When Abdu'l Bahá arrived in Paris in 1913, the German friends wrote to him asking him to visit them. He replied that he was uncertain that he could, as he was unwell with a bad cold. Many of the friends from Stuttgart, therefore, traveled to Paris instead to see him. However, on 1st April 1913, in the early evening, Abdu'l Bahá did travel and arrived in Stuttgart together with 4 of his Persian companions. However, what is most surprising was that he arrived unannounced and did not tell any of the Baha'is that he was visiting. He instructed the Persian men with him to wear Western clothes and to avoid attention, not to contact the newspapers, and he quietly checked into the Hotel Markelt in Stuttgart. Of course, it was not long before contact was made with one of the Baha'is in the city, who became so excited that he ran over to the hotel to meet Abdu'l Bahá. And soon after, streams of Baha'is came into the hotel, much to the surprise of the hotel staff, who could not understand the love and devotion that their own city folk were paying to these unknown and unexpected Eastern guests. Alma Knobloch has written, "Our joy was beyond measure. We had been working and serving at the break of the new day, and now the light of the Sun of Truth flooded the land, and we were grateful." Abdu'l Bahá's words gave new impetus to the cause in this country. Abdu'l Bahá stayed in Germany for a week, and during that time, he visited a number of places, and many Baha'is and friends met with him. This photograph of Abdu'l Bahá surrounded by festively dressed children with flowers in their hands was taken after the children's party to welcome him. This is in Esslingen, outside the hall of the museum where the party took place on April 4th, 1913. About 100 friends gathered at Villa Wagenburg in Stuttgart on April 6th. Johanna Hauff was most probably at this event, as the villa was directly opposite her own home, known as Villa Hauff. There is another photograph of the same event. During this time, Abdu'l Bahá spoke to the friends about crises and victories, and about the need for change. And you could say he was preparing them for the great turmoil that would face the country in the coming years during World War I. Certainly, by 1921, when Louise and John Bosch were traveling through Germany as part of a teaching trip on their way to the Holy Land, they found a community that was financially impoverished due to the effects of the catastrophic war they had experienced. And yet, the Baha'i community remained strong and resilient throughout. Johanna and her sister Julia both became confirmed Baha'is, and Abdu'l Bahá gave permission for Johanna, now aged 27, to join the Bosches for what was her first pilgrimage to the Holy Land. We should know that the friends who were in the Holy Land were aware that Abdu'l Bahá was nearing the end of his life, though of course they could never be fully prepared for the great loss that was to befall them. Johanna had understood from Louise Bosch that Abdu'l Bahá's time with them was short, and Louise said to her, quote, "His work is done, completely done. Everything has been said. Every further day is a gift of grace." Because of this, Johanna wrote that she did not dare to ask questions from Abdu'l Bahá or to pass on the letters from the friends in Germany, as she heard that there were still 400 letters lying there unanswered. But Abdu'l Bahá, in his kindness, wanted them anyway, and we will hear later on tonight that one of his last tablets was written to the friends in Germany. Johanna has recorded that Abdu'l Bahá treated her with great respect and appreciation and made her feel like his daughter. In the 2 weeks before his passing, she would spend time in the holy shrines, and in the evenings she sat quietly at the table with the master in the Western Pilgrim House. She recalls that one day Abdu'l Bahá asked her what was on her mind, and she asked him, "My thoughts are in Germany and the question of how, as a poor creature, can I do justice to this holy cause?" Abdu'l Bahá replied that he had been thinking about this himself and that he wished her to learn Arabic and Persian well so that she could directly translate the writings to German. He therefore arranged for her to have a Persian teacher immediately. In fact, Johanna did end up staying 3 months in Haifa, where she did learn Persian to the degree that she was able to translate portions of the hidden words into German. She did dedicate the rest of her life to studying Persian and Arabic, and translated many books for The Guardian and the Universal House of Justice, as well as serving for many years as a pioneer and as a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of Germany and Austria. And here's a beautiful photograph of her taken in 1974, the same year as she passed away.
We now move to the story of 2 other Baha'is from the United States, Grace and Florian Krug. Grace was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1870 and heard of the faith when she was in her 30s. Grace was known for her beautiful character, being described by one of her friends as, quote, "being the embodiment of her name, Grace, with an innate sense of courteous goodwill, dignity, and conviviality." She was very close to some of the early believers, such as Juliet Thompson, and went to many Baha'i meetings before she declared herself as a Baha'i. And around this time, she married Dr. Florian Krug, who was a man who had emigrated from Germany at the age of 26. He was a physician and perhaps was really quite contrast to Grace's gentle, kind character. In fact, he trained as a type of a fencer in a type of fencing called mensur, where the swordsman would deliberately strike each other across the face with the sword. The main philosophy of this fencing was to be able to stand your ground against any person or any idea which was in opposition to your own. He in fact fought 47 duels, of which one of them left him with a very large permanent scar down the left side of his face. Unlike Grace, who had accepted the faith and became a Baha'i very early on, Florian did not accept the faith and did not accept the teachings easily. In fact, he didn't only not accept them, he was quite vociferous against the faith and its teachings. He did allow Grace to attend Baha'i meetings, but there were apparently very significant family quarrels around this issue. One of the most memorable that has been recorded was in the year 1912 when Abdu'l Bahá was in New York. Grace was determined, despite the opposition of her husband, to invite Abdu'l Bahá to her home, and she went ahead. Their son, Charles, has recorded that he and his sister were cowering and watching from the top of the steps of their home as their father below them would scream at his wife and throw down books at her. But in spite of everything, Grace continued to invite the master to speak at their home, and he spoke at their home twice. And the children, on the first time that he was coming, could hear their father shouting, "If that old man comes into this house, I'll have the doorman throw him out." Both Charles and Louise, his sister, the two children, described the fateful day when Abdu'l Bahá did come. Charles said that his father's attitude was, "Now I can finally get my hands on the ringleader of this bunch." Louise, his sister, had said, "We were terrified. Charlie and I were standing there by the doors. Abdu'l Bahá came in. He came in and he put his arms out with that wonderful gesture. You could feel love pouring out. He walked right up to my father, looked him straight in the face, and he said, 'Dr. Krug, are you happy?' My father simply wilted and looked like a bird that had let its wings down to enjoy the sun. I don't know anyone who opposed the faith more violently than my father. But Abdu'l Bahá gave him that love that he could not resist. And from that day on, Dr. Krug never said a word against the master. In fact, he truly did become a lover of Abdu'l Bahá, and he found his own spiritual path in the Baha'i teachings. Once when Abdu'l Bahá was driving in a taxi cab with their son Charles, Abdu'l Bahá turned to Charles and said to him, "Write down what I'm going to say." Now you can imagine that if Abdu'l Bahá asks you to write down something that he's going to say, it must be something very important. And he said to him, "Charles, you must be very grateful to your mother. You must appreciate her greatly. You do not realize her station now or what a great honor she has bestowed on your household. She will be one of the most famous women of America. You must appreciate and love her very much. All will know of her servitude." Both Grace and Florian continued to serve in their communities and around the world. Actually, they went and did a lot of teaching, but we don't have time to share a lot of their story tonight. But by 1921, they decided, in fact, with the blessing of Abdu'l Bahá, to pack up their home in New York and to move to Haifa to serve Abdu'l Bahá. We have to recognize that this was quite a radical move for anyone to make. And in particular, it raised eyebrows amongst the social circles in New York, where Dr. Krug was renowned. He was a successful physician. He was an obstetrician and gynecologist. And we wanted to show you just some of the newspaper articles that came out. So this was an article which was in the New York Daily News that says, Religion's call, Dr. Florian Krug, a surgeon, will give up his profession here to go to Palestine to work on behalf of the Baha'i religion. He'll be accompanied by Mrs. Krug. And then on the very front page of the New York Herald on the 8th of April, 1921, oops, sorry, it's this one here. There was a title, "Doctor to give up all for Baha'ism, Florian Krug, convert, formerly agnostic, will go to Haifa, Palestine, sees Baha as a savior and believes the leader of universal religion, fulfills New Testament prophecy. So you can see that there was, and if you read the articles, there was quite a bit of scrutiny of him and ridicule, but both of them remained steadfast and firm in their conviction to serve Abdu'l Bahá, and they did pack up everything and left. They arrived in the Holy Land on the 18th of November, 10 days before Abdu'l Bahá's passing. So we know that by this time already John and Louise Bosch and Johanna Hauf had arrived just a couple of days before them, and then Grace and Florian Krug arrived. So they were taken to the Western Pilgrim House at 4 Haparsim Street, and we'll show you that picture in a moment, where Abdu'l Bahá welcomed them. And he asked Grace and Florian, when they had arrived at the Pilgrim House, then to follow him from the Pilgrim House. And this is a picture of Abdu'l Bahá outside his own home on 7 Haparsim. So this home was right opposite the Western Pilgrim House. And he took them through the gate of his own garden up to the stairs to a room over his garage where he would normally stay himself. And he said to them, "Now I am going to give you," he said this to Grace, "I am going to give you and Dr. Krug my room." Grace said, "I burst into tears. I don't know why such a feeling of apprehension came over me." Clearly, she understood that what Abdu'l Bahá was doing. His grandson, Ruhi Afnan, then tried to comfort me by saying, "The family are all very happy, Mrs. Krug, that the master has decided to move back into the big house, as we were anxious about him sleeping out here alone." So this is the house that this room he was giving them. You can see, this is in fact a photograph taken from that room, and it's from the doorway on the top garage of where he was staying. Abdu'l Bahá often used this room during the day, and from here he could see the shrine of the Bab, which is just visible in this photograph, although it's not easily visible probably on your screen. This is a photograph of Abdu'l Bahá in the courtyard of the Western Pilgrim House. And in fact, it's probably one of the very last photographs taken of Abdu'l Bahá, and shows him having to come and have lunch with the friends. Grace Krug has written about these days and talks about Abdu'l Bahá walking in this courtyard. And she says, "Friends, the last 9 days in which we were blessed with his presence on earth, his life from hour to hour was so busy and beautiful to watch, that after my early morning visit each day to the shrine of the Bab, I stood at my window to catch as many glimpses of the master as possible. In the morning, he would often seat himself in the garden under the grape arbor to receive the many visitors seeking his wisdom. There were generals in gaudy uniforms, Arabs, again a poor man or woman asking alms. He was so beautiful and serene, with a sweetness of spirit that I never noticed before. There was an air of finality and completeness about him."
Another Western Baha'i who was living in the Holy Land at this time was Curtis Kelsey. He was from New York and became a Baha'i in 1917 at the age of 23. He was a mechanic, having worked at the Ford plant in Detroit, but had also served in the American Armed Forces in World War I. Abdu'l Bahá was planning to install electrical lighting for the shrines of Baha'u'llah and the Bab, and had arranged for equipment such as generators, cables, and lighting to be sent from the United States. Curtis was identified as a person who could install the lights and was therefore invited in August 1921 to come to the Holy Land. He set out by ship, which would have normally taken 2 weeks, but had many delays and difficulties. He found himself finally in France, but was told there were no ships to the Middle East for many weeks. He then set out to Naples, Italy, but was also told that all the ships were booked up. He persevered and asked to be on what we would call now a standby list. And as it happened, one of the ships had to make an emergency stop in Naples on its way to Egypt because of one of the passengers had appendicitis. and Curtis was able to take his place on this ship. From Alexandria, Egypt, he took a train and finally made it to Haifa on September 25th, 1921. Much later than he had planned, but he got there eventually. He was met by Mr. Saichiro Fujita and Dr. Lutfullah Hakim, and taken in the master's wagon to the old Western Pilgrim House. Here's a photo of Abdu'l Bahá in the carriage taken soon after Curtis Kelsey's arrival there. Curtis Kelsey was taken to the Western Pilgrim House where a meal had been prepared for him, and then suddenly Abdu'l Bahá entered. He took Curtis's hand in his own, and after giving him a joyful welcome, said to him in English, "Did you notice how easy it was to get here?" Curtis stayed in the Holy Land, working not only on the electrical lighting for the shrines, but also on repairing the Cunningham and Ford cars that had been sent by the American Bahá'ís to Abdu'l Bahá, but were not functioning. Once he fixed them, he was able to drive Abdu'l Bahá up Mount Carmel. Here's a photo of Fujita in Abdu'l Bahá's 7-seater Cunningham, which had been sent by Helen Goodall and Ella Cooper. It was given so that pilgrims could be transported to Bahji. There was only one person in Haifa who owned a vehicle, but there was only one other person in Haifa who owned a vehicle. But despite this, Abdu'l Bahá preferred to travel by train, ride a donkey, or be pulled by a mule in his buckboard wagon. And of course, most often would walk from place to place, as shown in the photograph. Curtis Kelsey worked on installing the lights around the shrines of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, which took him 8 months, and in fact was only complete after Abdu'l Bahá's passing. We have to remember that at the time, there was no electricity in the area at all, and this was a completely new phenomenon for the residents of both Haifa and Akka. Abdu'l Bahá, however, had made a promise and said, "In the future, the distance between Akka and Haifa will be built up, and the two cities will join and clasp hands, become the two terminal sections of one mighty metropolis." As I look now over this scene, I see so clearly that it will become one of the first emporiums of the world. This great semicircular bay will be transformed into the finest harbor, wherein the ships of all nations will seek shelter and refuge. He goes on to say, "At night, the great city will be lighted by electricity. The entire harbor from Akka to Haifa will be one path of illumination. Mount Carmel itself, from top to bottom, will be submerged in a sea of lights." A person standing on the summit of Mount Carmel and the passengers of the steamers coming to it will look upon the most sublime and majestic spectacle of the whole world. The official first illumination of the shrines occurred on Rezvan 1922, and Curtis Kelsey has written that he had put large searchlights on the shrine of the Bab and on the shrine of Baha'u'llah in Bahji. He records, "You could see these two lights from one shrine to another. The people of Haifa hadn't seen electric light around that time. The children were so intrigued by this light that they would play in the shadows of the searchlight on Mount Carmel and run up and down the street." We mentioned that the early pilgrims, when they arrived, were received here at the Western Pilgrim House. In the weeks and days leading up to Abdu'l Bahá's passing, many of the friends stayed here, including the Bosches and Johanna Hof. Curtis Kelsey was given a small room in the back of the Pilgrim House, which he shared with 2 other people, Mr. Lutfullah Hakim and Saichiro Fujita. These 3 men lived together as 3 brothers for 8 months in this tiny room where there were apparently 3 beds, a bookshelf, a table, and a lamp.
Lutfullah Hakim was born in Iran and was the grandson of Hakim Masih, who was the first Jewish person to become a Baha'i. He was studying physiotherapy in London when Abdu'l Bahá visited there. Later, when Mr. Hakim came on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, Abdu'l Bahá asked him to accompany Shoghi Effendi for his studies in Oxford. He called him back, however, in 1921, so that he could assist with the pilgrims in the Holy Land, particularly as he was so fluent in English. After Abdu'l Bahá's passing, Hakim continued to serve the faith in many ways, during one period, returning to Persia as an assistant to Dr. Susan Moody, who served as his physician in Iran. He later served on the First International Baha'i Council and was an elected member of the First Universal House of Justice. You can see him in this photograph, third from the right, holding a cane.
Finally, we come to introduce Mr. Saichiro Fujita, whom we've already briefly mentioned. Fujita, as he was affectionately known by the Friends, was born in Japan and immigrated to the United States at the age of 17. He was taught the faith around 1905 by Catherine Franklin and Helen Goodall while studying in Oakland, California. He was the second Japanese person to accept the faith. Fujita had the opportunity to meet Abdu'l Bahá when he came to Chicago in 1912. As you can see from this photograph with Mr. Montfort Mills, Fujita was not a very tall man. So when Abdu'l Bahá arrived in Chicago, Fujita climbed up a lamppost in order to see over the crowd that had gathered to meet him. When Abdu'l Bahá saw Fujita, he said, "Come down, Sachias, for this day I would sup with thee." Abdu'l Bahá was referring and repeating the biblical story of a short man named Sachias who climbed a sycamore tree in order to get a better view of Christ. Later, Fujita was invited by Abdu'l Bahá to travel with him, along with the other 4 Persian companions. At one of the stops in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, they went to have dinner at a restaurant, and Abdu'l Bahá noticed that the table had been set only for 5 people. When he asked the waiter the reason for this, he responded, quote, "Surely he is your servant." Abdu'l Bahá replied that whether he was a servant or not, or whether he was another color or not, made no difference, saying, "We are all one," and insisted that a place be made for him to sit with. Abdu'l Bahá invited Fujita to the Holy Land in 1919. Fujita served him on the project to illuminate the shrines. He drove the master's car, looked after the pilgrims, and served as a gardener for many years. One of the things we have heard about Fujita was that he loved to make the master laugh. Curtis Kelly wrote about Fujita. The family loved Fujita dearly, especially the master, showing special care over the precious pearl from Japan. Every day, the two would have breakfast together alone. It was a time of peace when the master could bask in the light of Fujita's purity, not having to meet any demands. Often their breakfasts were feasts of laughter, especially after Abdu'l Bahá asked Fujita to grow a beard. When fully grown, it was at best a thin collection of long hairs, nothing like the thick, luxuriant beards Persians grow. The master enjoyed stroking Fujita's wispy beard, usually making him laugh. Fujita, who took care of the cat of Abdu'l Bahá, would always lock the cat in the kitchen during lunch. He did that just to hear the master say, "Let the cat out," which of course Fujita would do. As soon as the kitchen door was open, the cat would dart to the feet of Abdu'l Bahá, who would stroke and feed her. After gobbling the food down, the cat would brush against the master's feet and purr loudly. Everybody knew it was a joke, but it was all for fun. After Abdu'l Bahá's passing, Fujita continued to serve Shoghi Effendi in the Holy Land for many years, and later the Universal House of Justice. Many pilgrims to the Holy Land have memories of his radiant spirit and sense of humor. One of these pilgrims is my grandmother, actually, who is one of these 2 girls on either side of Fujita who went on pilgrimage in 1957 and was able to meet the guardian a few months before his passing. I'm actually not sure which one is my grandmother because she has an identical twin.
So Shamim's mother is one of the 2.
So now that we've spent a bit of time introducing and sharing the stories of the arrival of these Western Bahá'ís to the Holy Land, we're going to take a short break with a little bit of music that we're going to play. And after that, we're going to continue our story. And then when we continue, we're going to share some of the recollections of these friends about the time of Abdu'l Bahá's passing when they were there, and a little bit about his funeral as well.
The music is 2 minutes, really.
It's only a very short music. It's 2 minutes, 2-3 minutes long.
Thank you. This piece was just recorded last week. Julie and I, she's in Halifax right now, but she says hello, and we made this recording especially for the Centenary. So.
Thank you. So we're just going to return to the story of the pilgrims, and we wanted to share with you that these accounts are recorded in many books, including the Baha'i World and many other secondary sources of material. But these two books have recently come out, which are also very wonderful. When the Moon Set Over Haifa tells the story of these pilgrims in more detail, and it's in our local bookshop. And also this book, Fragrance of Glory by Michael Day, has also recently come out with many photographs as well, which are wonderful. But we want to, before we share the events of the day of his passing, we just wanted to reflect a few moments with you on the fact that even though Abdu'l Bahá knew very clearly that he was reaching the end of his life, and that he was becoming weaker and weaker, he never stopped his work and never stopped his service.
Two weeks before his passing, Abdu'l Bahá spoke to his faithful gardener, Ismail Agha, saying, "I am so fatigued. The hour is come when I must leave everything and take my flight. I am too weary to walk." It was during the closing days of the Blessed Beauty, when I engaged in gathering together his papers, which were strewn over the sofa in his writing chamber in Bahji, that he turned to me and said, "It is of no use to gather them. I must leave them and flee away. I also have finished my work. I can do nothing more. Therefore must I leave it and take my departure." A few days before he passed away, he shared his longing to leave this world in a tablet addressed to the American believers. "I have renounced the world and the people thereof. In the cage of this world I flutter even as a frightened bird, and yearn every day to take my flight unto thy kingdom. Ya Baha'u'llah, make me drink of the cup of sacrifice and set me free."
This photograph is one of the last photographs that was ever taken of Abdu'l Bahá. It was taken by Lutfullah Hakim, who took many of these photographs we're looking at, and shows Abdu'l Bahá as a pallbearer in the front, carrying the casket of Mirza Hassan Afnan. This Baha'i, who was a descendant of the family of the Bab, was living in the Holy Land and was very attached to the Master. On 18th of November, Abdu'l Bahá developed a cold, and this man, realizing that this signaled a great calamity, could not bear to imagine living without Abdu'l Bahá. He dismissed his servant, saying that he was going away, wrote a supplication to Abdu'l Bahá, walked for 2 hours, and arriving at the shore of the Mediterranean, he threw himself into the sea. The next day, his body was found, and Abdu'l Bahá came to accompany the friends to his funeral. After this, Abdu'l Bahá advised the friends, "You must not injure yourselves or commit suicide. It is not permissible to do to yourselves what Mirza Hassan Afnan did to himself. Should anyone at any time encounter hard and perplexing times, he must say to himself, 'This will soon pass.' Then he will be calm and quiet. In all my calamities and difficulties, I used to say to myself, 'This will pass away.' Then I became patient. If anyone cannot be patient and cannot endure, and if he wishes to become a martyr, then let him arise in service to the cause of God. It will be better for him if he attains to martyrdom in this path. Arise ye in service to the cause of God, as the apostles arose after the departure of Christ."
In the following days, even though Abdu'l Bahá was unwell and greatly fatigued, he continued his work and service. On November 25th, 4 days before his passing, he attended the noonday prayer at the mosque, as was his custom. He distributed alms to the poor, which he had done for many decades since his days in Akka.
Only 48 hours before Abdu'l Bahá passed away, he insisted on officiating the wedding of one of his servants. This servant, Agha Khosrow, was of Burmese origin, and he had faithfully accompanied Abdu'l Bahá during his travels in Europe. He served as his cook and prepared food and tea for him. This photograph here shows Agha Khosrow standing on the left. The others in the photograph are important as well. You may recognize Shoghi Effendi, who's aged 5 or 6, sitting on the right side. And next to him, seated on the left, is Haji Mirza Haider Ali, who was one of the outstanding Baha'is of our era, known as the Delight of the Hearts. And standing on the right, with his hand to his chest, is Mirza Mahmud Zarghani, who was the Abdu'l Bahá's assistant and his secretary, and he wrote a diary for him, really, as he had his travels through the West. Abdu'l Bahá loved Khosrow very much, and in fact, he had taken him into his own family at the age of 6, when Khosrow was 6 years old. The child, in fact, was first seen by a Baha'i in a slave market in India. And this Baha'i felt so moved for the child that he paid for Khosrow to be released and brought him to Abdu'l Bahá. Abdu'l Bahá took Khosrow into his own family. He educated him and made sure that before he passed away that he would be married. And he chose for him a very wonderful Persian lady who was a daughter of a martyr for them to be married together. Abdu'l Bahá said to Khosrow, he said, "Khosrow, you have spent your childhood and youth in the service of this house. It is my hope that you will grow old under that same roof, ever and always serving God." Abdu'l Bahá's very last tablet was graciously revealed for his loved ones in Stuttgart in Germany, just Stuttgart, the home of Johanna Hauff. And his reflections on this transient world and his counsels to us are important for all of us to reflect on. And this is from the tablet that he's written. "O ye beloved of the Lord, in this mortal world, nothing whatsoever endureth. The peoples of the earth dwell therein and spend a number of days uselessly, ultimately descending beneath the dust, repairing to the home or eternal silence, leaving behind them no achievement, no blessing, no result, no fruit. All the days of their life are thus brought to naught. Whereas the children of the kingdom sow seeds in the fertile soil of truth that will eventually spring up and bring forth many a harvest, and shall forever bestow upon mankind its increase and bountiful grace. They shall obtain eternal life, attain unto the imperishable bounty, and shine even as the radiant stars in the firmament of the divine kingdom. The glory of glories rest upon you." Abdu'l Bahá's fever continued to worsen following his cold, which started on the 18th of November. And by the evening of the 26th of November, he had a fever of 40 degrees. He developed chills and asked to wear the fur-lined coat of Baha'u'llah, which he often wore when he was cold or feeling unwell. He then said to his daughter, Munawwar Khanum, "Cover me up. I am cold. Last night I did not sleep well. I felt cold. This is serious. It is the beginning." After midnight, he asked for some tea, and by the next morning his fever had gone. He sent for all the Baha'is in the Holy Land to attend a feast at the shrine of the Bab in honor of the Day of the Covenant. He himself went and had some tea with the family, accepted still to receive the Mufti of Haifa, the mayor of Haifa, and a Muslim judge into his home. Whilst they were in the Holy Land, Louise Bosch wrote a letter to the Baha'is of San Francisco, describing exactly what happened on this last day. And we're going to share with you a few excerpts from this letter, describing the events from her perspective. We'll be sharing this letter between the four of us with you now.
On Sunday morning, November 27th, the day before his passing, a message came from Abdu'l Bahá saying that he wished all of us to go to the tomb of the Bab to attend a feast that would be given there for the Day of the Covenant. We arrived at the tomb of the Bab shortly after 3 o'clock and found a goodly number of people already assembled there. This took place in the same room of the shrine of the Bab in which Abdu'l Bahá was to be buried the following day, though nobody of course knew this. About 125 believers were present at the feast. It was a beautiful feast, though a solemn one. There was no joyousness among the believers. They were sad because the Master was not with them. He had not come. He had excused himself for not coming. Tablets were chanted and speeches were made, but evident gloom pervaded all hearts, so much so that I came to the conclusion that Abdu'l Bahá could never have been absent from any feasts before when at Haifa at all.
When the feast was over and we came down from the mountain, it was already somewhat dark, for it was November and the sun had set early. I was approaching the residence of Abdu'l Bahá and found myself standing alone in front of the garden gate. I felt a great longing to enter, hoping to see Abdu'l Bahá. Nevertheless, I hesitated. At 8 o'clock that evening, Mrs. Krug came to the pilgrim house for supper and spoke to us of Abdu'l Bahá. Abdu'l Bahá had been told that the believers were unhappy at the feast because he was not there. Mrs. Krug told us that he had replied that he was there in spirit and that the friends should not attach importance to the absence of the body.
Abdu'l Bahá, after having gone to bed around 10 o'clock, again slept apparently until nearly 11 o'clock. Then he roused and his daughter Ruha Khanum came to his bed. She saw that Abdu'l Bahá had perspired much. She poured some water for him, which he drank. She then went to his dresser to obtain a fresh night garment for him. But, alas, she found none. Her father, as usual, had given everything away. At the time this was related to me, I thought of a beautiful cotton nightshirt that my husband and myself had brought along with us from a believer in Germany, who sent it by us to Abdu'l Bahá as a present. It was a fine gentleman's garment, all handmade by the sender, of the best pre-war cotton goods and embroidered with Abdu'l Bahá's monogram. It seemed superfluous to ask what had become of it. No doubt it had gone by the way all such things would go when given to Abdu'l Bahá, the father of the poor.
At around 1:30 a.m., she then writes, I was suddenly awakened by a peculiar knock at the side door of the pilgrim house. And what a knock it was! Such a knock I had never heard in the stillness of the night. It was a knock that spoke louder than cannons. It was a knock with no reserve to it. It was a knock of desperation. It was a knock that would fain rouse the whole world. It seemed to me, though, that Fujita was all too slow to light his candle to go to the door, for no electric lights were at that time at the houses there. I returned to my room and said to my husband, do get up at once and dress. I went to Johanna's door to tell her the same. She was up, standing in the middle of her room in the dark. She said, yes, something terrible must have happened, for I heard them over in the garden calling for Dr. Krug. I returned to my room and rushed into my clothes when Fujita came to the door saying, come quickly to the master's house. The master is very low. On the street, I realized that I was trembling intensely and could hardly walk.
I soon stood at the door of Abdu'l Bahá's bedroom and saw in the room Dr. Krug and Dr. Rifai, a visiting believer of Beirut, standing close by each other, and one of the holy ladies sitting on the edge of the divan, and Ruha Khanum kneeling on the floor at the side of the bed of her father. I entered the room and dropping on my knees beside her, but Abdu'l Bahá was in bed, the mosquito netting drawn back at one side. His eyes were closed as though he was sleeping.
Johanna Hauff wrote, what terrible hours were these tonight at the deathbed of the beloved master. At 1 o'clock at night, Monday morning, we were called and told the master was very low. Quickly, we went down into the sorrowing house to his bedside. For a long time, I did not know whether he was still with his body or had ascended into his kingdom. He is no longer among us. Oh no, we must not say this. His spirit is perhaps 1,000 times nearer to us. But it is incredible, unbelievable, because this great loss came so swift, so unexpected. We are all stunned I cannot say anything. I do not know what will happen.
Grace Krug also described seeing Abdu'l Bahá, and she says, "Friends, how can I describe that scene in the master's bedroom? Dr. Krug stood in the center, his hand raised, saying, 'Silence, our beloved master has ascended.' I ran to his bedside, and there he lay in the majesty of death. His lovely eyes were still open, but the light of love and understanding that had for so many years cheered the souls of men was gone. My first thought was, my adored one is freed from our endless questions, freed from his life of servitude and headaches. I turned and knelt at the feet of his sister, the greatest holy leaf, put my head in her lap, and in that agonized moment, she stroked my head and tried to comfort me. Friends, not one thought of herself. God has never created a more glorious woman than she."
Curtis Kelsey has also written, "Of course, pandemonium broke loose when the master passed. So many people arrived at the house wailing. I looked around at what was going on, and I saw the greatest holy leaf, the sister of the master, going around to this one and the other one, comforting them. Then she walked over to me and said, 'Kelsey, will you take Fujita and Busra in the automobile and drive to Akka to tell the friends there of the master's passing and then come right back?'
We wish to take a moment to reflect on the station of the greatest holy leaf. Marcia Gale has written the following tribute to her. The most exalted leaf wept far less than the others, at all times maintaining her great dignity and composure. But many times she sighed through the night and many times uttered the words, 'Ya Ilahi, O God, my God.' 2 years younger than her beloved brother, Bahir Khanum, was the most precious great adorning of Baha'u'llah's house. All her days, she was denied a moment of tranquility. Abdu'l Bahá had written, 'Mother-like, she circled in adoration around the undying flame. Her life had spanned the conference of Badasht, the martyrdom of the Bab, the birth of the Baha'i faith, as her father lay chained in the black pit of Tehran, the peril, destitution, and humiliation of years of captivity and exile, the death of Baha'u'llah, the Great War, when the enemy had determined to crucify Abdu'l Bahá and all his family on the heights of Carmel. She had stood by her brother when their father left the world. And Abdu'l Bahá, because he was named the successor, was deserted by his people, forsaken, betrayed, assaulted by almost the entire body of his relatives. Now, for a brief period, Khanum, at 75, was the de facto head of the Baha'i world. She was the custodian of Abdu'l Bahá's will and testament, and her loving, sorrowing messages rallied the grief-obliterated Baha'is of the East and West. Now she was destined to stand beside and support yet another crucial figure in Baha'i history, destined to be Shoghi Effendi Road, the sole earthly sustainer, the joy and solace of my life.
Likewise, Munir Khanum, the beloved wife of Abdu'l Bahá, was undoubtedly herself grief-stricken, but she too comforted other pilgrims on the night of his ascension. She has written that should she describe her grief fully, she would need 70 reams of paper, and seas of blood would pour from all eyes. and she asks Abdu'l Bahá to call her to that other land. For, quote, I am caught in the talons of the eagle of sorrow.
John Bosch recalls the events of the following morning. The hour for the funeral had been set for 9 o'clock the next morning, Tuesday, November 29th. By 8 o'clock, the house, yards, and garden were filled with mourners. They came in great numbers to attend the funeral. As we entered the room, I saw to my surprise a casket. It was very plain, of white wood, unpainted. We carried it across the hall to the room in which lay the body of Abdu'l Bahá. We placed it upon 2 chairs, and when it was uncovered, I observed that it was zinc-lined. 2 of the persons present placed in it a most exquisite silken comforter, leaving the sides hanging over. Turning to the bed, I noticed that the body of Abdu'l Bahá was wrapped in 3 white silken sheets, which were folded over him from both sides. Ruhi Effendi and others then prepared to place the body in the casket. They were at the head, Mirza Jalal at the center, I at the feet. We gently laid his body in the casket, and someone put a silken pillow under the head. The best attar of rose was sprinkled over Abdu'l Bahá. Then both sides of the comfort were drawn up and laid over him. The cover was then placed upon the casket, and at once, as from an invisible command, 6 of us raised it to our shoulder, I being at the head. We carried it to the large room outside and lowered it to the floor. Beautiful ivory silk cover was laid over it, also one of the many wreaths that had been sent. A call was given, the doors were opened, and many people entered the room. Sharply at 9 o'clock, the casket was lifted from the floor by the appointed pallbearers, who carried it out the front door, down the steps, and through the gate along the short street about the length of 2 of our city clocks to the road which led up Mount Carmel.
There were about 10,000 people at this funeral, which was the largest funeral that had been seen in the Haifa Akka area. About 40 carriages were waiting at the gate to join in the funeral cortege, but only about 5 were occupied, as all who possibly could wished to honor the master that they had loved by humbly walking after his remains instead of using the carriage. Even the British High Commissioner, who had come specially from Jerusalem, walked with the others. Beside him in full uniform was the chief of police of Haifa, who had left his horse standing from the street near the house of Abdu'l Bahá. The governor of Phoenicia also walked.
There were men of all nations, of all creeds, of all walks of life, high and low, rich and poor. It seemed that never had there been such a funeral procession before. So great was the desire to help carry the casket up the mountain that some of the men were wrangling for the privilege of only touching it with their fingertips. For a house and a half, the great mass of people slowly moved along the winding road up the streets, the steep incline of Mount Carmel.
It was a perfect day, one of the most beautiful ones one could imagine. As I turned and looked back now and then, many were the thoughts that came to me as I watched all those people wending their way up the mountain. Ahead was the tomb of the Bab. Behind were the blue Mediterranean and the Bay of Haifa. And 9 miles away was the old city of Akka. And in the far distance, the Lebanon mountains. Never can I forget that scene. This is a photograph of the Boy Scouts in the front of the procession, holding wooden bars to keep the procession from overflowing. This impressive triumphal procession was headed by a guard of honor, consisting of the city constabulary force, followed by the Boy Scouts of the Muslim and Christian communities, holding aloft their banners, a company of Muslim choristers chanting their verses from the Quran, the chiefs of the Muslim community headed by the Mufti, a number of Christian priests, Latin, Greek, and Anglican, all preceding the sacred coffin, upraised on the shoulders of his loved ones. Immediately behind it came the members of his family. Next to them walked the British High Commissioner, the governor of Jerusalem, and the governor of Phoenicia. After them came the consuls and the notables of the land, followed by the vast multitude of those who reverenced and loved him.
As they slowly wended their way up Mount Carmel, the vineyard of God, the casket appeared in the distance to be borne aloft by invisible hands. So high above the heads of the people was it carried. After 2 hours walking, they reached the garden of the tomb of the Bab. Tenderly was the sacred coffin placed upon a plain table covered with a fair white linen cloth. As the vast concourse pressed round the tabernacle of his body, waiting to be laid in its resting place within the vault, next to that of the Bab, representatives of the various denominations, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, all hearts being ablaze with fervent love of Abdu'l Bahá. Some, on the impulse of the moment, others prepared, raised their voices in eulogy and regret, paying their last homage of farewell to their loved ones. So united were they in their acclamation of him as the wise educator and reconciler of the human race in this perplexed and sorrowful age, that there seemed to be nothing left for the Baha'is to say.
There were many who gave speeches and eulogies of the Master. We cannot read them tonight, but we'll leave you with just one paragraph from the Muslim Mufti of Haifa, who said, quote, "O thou revered voyager, thou hast lived greatly and hast died greatly. This great funeral procession is but a glorious proof of thy greatness in thy life and in thy death. But O thou whom we have lost, thou leader of men, generous and benevolent, to whom shall the poor now look? Who shall care for the hungry and the desolate, the widow and the orphan?" Later that evening, Abdu'l Bahá's casket was brought to the underground vault of the shrine. The Master's casket was oriented so as to face Bahji and placed in such a way that was not in front of the sarcophagus containing the remains of the Bab. Rahmatullah Najaf Abadi, the caretaker of the shrine of the Bab, was so physically strong that he was able to lower Abdu'l Bahá's casket single-handedly without any trouble. He easily lifted the casket and carried it down to the crypt by himself. After the funeral, he remembered Abdu'l Bahá asking him a puzzling question before he passed away. Abdu'l Bahá asked him, "You are a strong man. Could you not carry me away to a place where I could rest? I'm tired of this world."
On the 7th day after the passing of the Master, corn was distributed in his name to about 1,000 poor of Haifa, irrespective of race or religion, to whom he had always been a friend and a protector. In the first 7 days, also from 50 to 100 poor were daily fed at the Master's house, in the very place where it had been his custom to give alms to them. On the 9th day, 138 pilgrims and residents of the Holy Land went from Haifa to Akka to visit the shrine of Baha'u'llah.
On the 40th day, there was a memorial feast given to over 600 of the people of Haifa. Sorry, this picture is actually a picture from the shrine of Baha'u'llah from earlier. A feast was given to over 600 people of Haifa and Akka and the surrounding parts of Palestine and Syria. More than 100 of the poor were also fed on this day. The governor of Phoenicia, many other officials, and Europeans were present. The feast was entirely arranged by the members of the master's household. The long tables were decorated with trailing branches of bougainvillea. Its lovely purple blooms mingled with the white narcissus, and the large dishes of golden oranges out of the beloved master's garden made a picture of loveliness in those spacious, lofty rooms, whose only other decoration was the gorgeous yet subdued coloring of rare Persian rugs. No useless, trivial ornaments marred the extreme dignity of simplicity. The guests received each and all the same welcome. There was no chief place. Here, as always in the master's home, there was no respecting of persons. After the luncheon, the guests came into the large hall, this also bare of ornament, save only for the portrait of him that they had assembled to honor, and some antique Persian tapestries hung on one wall. Before this was placed on a platform from which speeches were made to the rapt and silent throng whose very hearts were listening. The governor of Phoenicia, in the course of his address, said the following: Most of us here have, I think, a clear picture of Sir Abdu'l Bahá Abbas, of his dignified figure, walking thoughtfully in our streets, of his courteous and gracious manner, of his kindness, of his love for little children and flowers, of his generosity and care for the poor and suffering. So gentle was he and so simple that in his presence one almost forgot that he was also a great teacher, and that his writings and his conversations have been a solace and an inspiration to hundreds and thousands of people in the East and in the West. Dear friends, this concludes our stories for tonight. What we're going to do now is play a short devotional. We'll start with a short video, and then we'll have time for some prayers and some readings before we read the Tablet of Visitation. We know that the time of passing of Abdu'l Bahá was sometime after 1 o'clock and up to 1:30 in the morning. We'll say some prayers now during this time.
Praise be to him who hath honored the land of Ba through the presence of him round whom all names revolve. All the atoms of the earth have announced unto all created things that from behind the gate of the prison city there hath appeared, and above its horizon there hath shone forth the orb of the beauty of the great, the most mighty branch of God. His ancient and immutable mystery proceeding on its way to another land. Sorrow thereby hath enveloped this prison city, whilst another land rejoiceth.
Blessed, doubly blessed is the ground on which his footsteps have trodden. The eye that had been cheered by the beauty of his countenance. The ear that had been honored by hearkening to his call. The heart that had tasted the sweetness of his love. The breast that had dilated through his remembrance. The pen that had voiced his praise. The scroll that had borne the testimony of his writings. We beseech God, blessed and exalted be he, that he may honor us with meeting him soon. He is in truth the all-hearing, the all-powerful, he who is ready to answer.
O Lord my God, assist thy loved ones to be firm in thy faith, to walk in thy ways, to be steadfast in thy cause. Give them thy grace to withstand the onslaught of self and passion, to follow the light of divine guidance. Thou art the powerful, the gracious, the self-subsisting, the bestower, the compassionate, the almighty, the all-bountiful.
O thou who art the apple of mine eye, Baha'u'llah in his own handwriting thus addresses Abdu'l Bahá. My glory, the ocean of thy loving kindness, the sun of my bounty, the heaven of thy mercy rest upon thee. We pray God to illumine the world through thy knowledge and wisdom, to ordain for thee that which shall gladden thine heart and impart consolation to thine eyes.
O thou incomparable God, we are thy humble servants, and thou art the all-glorious. We are sinners, and thou art the ever-forgiving. We are captives, poor and lovely, and thou art our shelter and our aid. We are as tiny ants, and thou art the Lord of majesty, enthroned in the highest heaven. Protect us as a token of thy grace, and withhold not from us thy care and assistance. O Lord, thy tests are indeed severe, and thy trials can lay in ruin foundations wrought of steel. Preserve and strengthen us, cheer and gladden our hearts. Graciously assist us to serve, even as Abdu'l Bahá, thy sacred threshold. Abdu'l Bahá.
Likewise, Miss Knobloch traveled alone in Germany. To what a great extent she became confirmed. Therefore know ye of a certainty that whosoever arises in this day to diffuse the divine fragrances, the cohorts of the kingdom of God shall confirm him, and the bestowals and the favors of the blessed perfection shall encircle him. Oh, that I could travel, even though on foot, and in the utmost poverty to these regions, and raising the call of Ya Baha'u'llah in cities, villages, mountains, deserts, and oceans, promote the divine teachings. This, alas, I cannot do. How intensely I deplore it. Please God, ye may achieve it.
O thou incomparable God, O thou Lord of the kingdom, these souls are thy heavenly army. Assist them, and with the cohorts of the supreme concourse, make them victorious, so that each one of them may become like unto a regiment, and conquer these countries through the love of God and the illumination of divine teachings. O God, be thou their supporter and their helper, and in the wilderness, the mountain, the valley, the forest, the prairies, and the seas, be thou their confidant, so that they may cry out through the power of the kingdom and the breath of the Holy Spirit. Verily, thou art the powerful, the mighty, and the omnipotent, and thou art the wise, the hearing, and the seeing.
My name is Abdu'l Bahá. My qualification is Abdu'l Bahá. My reality is Abdu'l Bahá. My praise is Abdu'l Bahá. Thraldom to the blessed perfection is my glorious and refulgent diadem, and servitude to all the human race, my perpetual religion. No name, no title, no mention, no commendation have I, nor will I ever have, except Abdu'l Bahá. This is my longing, this is my greatest yearning, this is my eternal life, this is my everlasting glory.
He is the all-glorious. O God, my God, lowly and tearful, I raise my suppliant hands to thee, and cover my face in the dust of that threshold of thine, exalted above the knowledge of the learned, and the praise of all that glorify thee. Graciously look upon thy servant, humble and lowly at thy door, with the glances of the eye of thy mercy, and immerse him in the ocean of thine eternal grace. Lord, he is a poor and lowly servant of thine, enthralled and imploring thee, captive in thy hand, praying fervently to thee, trusting in thee, in tears before thy face, calling to thee and beseeching thee, saying, O Lord my God, give me thy grace to serve thy loved ones. Strengthen me in my servitude to thee. Illumine my brow with the light of adoration in thy court of holiness, and of prayer to thy kingdom of grandeur. Help me to be selfless at the heavenly entrance of thy gate, and aid me to be detached from all things within thy holy precincts. Lord, give me to drink from the chalice of selflessness. With its robe clothe me, and in its ocean immerse me. Make me as dust in the pathway of thy loved ones, and grant that I may offer up my soul for the earth ennobled by the footsteps of thy chosen ones in thy path, O Lord of glory in the highest. With this prayer doth thy servant call thee, at dawntide and in the night season, Fulfill his heart's desire, O Lord. Illumine his heart, gladden his bosom, kindle his light, that he may serve thy cause and thy servants. Thou art the bestower, the pitiful, the most bountiful, the gracious, the merciful, the compassionate. Abdu'l-Baha.